personalities, and our students are the best students in the world in terms of dealing with personalities. Okay? And they keep smiling and keep coming back for more, etc., which is spectacular.
Yes, sir.
They work hard, play hard, and take lots of risks, which is very important. So please understand that after we applaud this last presentation, stay around because there will be some other comments, etc. So let's go to the Eastern Shore and Mead Works, and our friend Kyle is going to take us there. He is a dual degree, double major also, real estate and architecture.
Yep. All right, well, last presentation of the day. Thank you for everybody sticking around. I have some mead for tasting over here to the side, so help yourself if you feel like getting a drink. But first, I have to start this presentation by thanking my thesis chair, Peter Noonan, as well as Professor Carl Dupuy for really pushing me and getting me to this point. It's been quite a journey over the past year working on this thesis. So Mead Works is a thesis that explores the relationship of people, the environment, and the infrastructure that mitigates between and attempts placemaking in a place that is commonly disregarded and shoved to the edge of towns and cities. And the idea for this thesis was really influenced by my study abroad trip to Scandinavia in the summer of 2018, where we visited a lot of projects that seem to seamlessly incorporate public infrastructure into the design. And so with that, I aimed to sort of take that stance and try to apply it to a local context. So this presentation is organized into 4 main parts. I'll take you through the general context and frame the architectural issue that's at hand, and then we'll go into the site chosen for this experiment, as well as the final architectural solution. And so when looking for a site, I looked for areas that had specific water and infrastructure related issues. And there's no doubt that our own region, the Chesapeake Bay watershed, is really facing a water quality crisis. Chesapeake Bay watershed is the largest estuary in the US and the 3rd largest in the world. It covers 64,000 square miles of land across 6 states, including all of DC. And it also has over 200 jurisdictions, which is why the Chesapeake Bay really struggles to enact any bay-wide policies that really actually affect change. And so this model is more of a local focused solution. The region is also home to over 18 million people, most of who live within just a short distance of the expansive tidewater shoreline. And with a 14-to-1 land-to-water ratio, this really illustrates that whatever is done on land compounds and has an even greater effect on the waterways and the water systems. And the population isn't done growing. It's growing by 150,000 people per year, and development is constantly threatening the fragile ecosystems, particularly around DC and Baltimore and Northern Virginia. But also there's a large existence of agriculture, particularly on the Eastern Shore. And this was helpful in narrowing down site selection. In 2018, the Bay was given a C rating and an overall health score of 47%, just illustrating that it has a lot of room for improvement. Most of this pollution comes from agriculture and widespread development, leaching pesticides and insecticides into the waterways, causing algal blooms, hypoxia, and dead zones. These chemicals and agricultural practices of sort of large swaths of monoculture crops also reduce biodiversity and habitat for pollinators and are affecting the bee populations across the US. And so these two issues are really intertwined. But how is this an architectural issue? At the core of it, there's sort of a fundamental disconnect between people and the infrastructure that mitigates between their use of resources, specifically water, and those outputs to the environment. And so without understanding where your water comes from and what happens to it and all of the processes involved with it, the Bay really can't expect to improve. And a typical person using 80 to 100 gallons of water a day and not knowing where that comes from and where it goes is quite significant. As most of you probably know, there's really like three main types of water. There's fresh water, which comes from the atmosphere, the grounds or surface sources, and it is purified and then distributed for use. It then either becomes gray water or black water. Gray water is contaminated from sinks, showers, and laundry. However, this can be reused and recycled for flushing toilets and irrigating landscapes. Otherwise, it's treated and released back into the environment. Whereas black water contains pathogens from fecal matter and is not able to be reused and is treated at sewage treatment plants before being released back into the environment. And so it's a constant cycle of water coming in and going out. But this begs the question of how water infrastructure can transform from a secluded private type of architecture into a more public and civic place. So through my research and observations of the sites that we visited in Scandinavia, there were really two core guidelines that I set up. And one of the main things is that infrastructure needs to be sited in a highly visible and public place. But also it needs to be paired with another public function, such as a landscape, park, or other public use to attract people to visit. And for the purpose of this thesis, that pairing is a meadery, but other compatible light industries such as breweries, meaderies, and wineries and distilleries all share in common a real tie to water and the environment with the infrastructure. So all of these light industries have the power to attract people and integrate with the similar systems and cycles. And this power to attract the people is really illustrated by the fact that over 10 million people visit craft breweries every year. It's quite a social gathering for people. But one of the largest growing sectors of the beverage industry is, which is mead. And for those of you who don't know, mead is an alcoholic beverage that is made from fermenting honey in water with yeast. It's very simple. It's not a beer, it's not a wine, it's a category of its own. And I think it's quite tasty. It's sort of a dessert wine, so everybody can have a taste over here also. But what makes mead fundamentally different from beer and wine is the intermediary role that the bee plays in the production. For beer and wine, you harvest the crops or the grapes and ferment it into the product, whereas mead requires the bee to transform the raw natural product of nectar and pollen into the honey before then it can be transformed by man into the drink. Mead is also thought to be one of the oldest intoxicating beverages consumed by man. Believe it or not, the Romans and the Greeks really enjoyed mead before the rise of winemaking took over. But it also has shown up significantly in mythology and stories of Odin and Beowulf. And then the image on the far right is an example of how mead is starting to influence the beverage industry today. If anybody is familiar with Budweiser commercials for Bud Light, they like to play a joke on mead and try to discourage their market from trying mead. So if you haven't seen them, I recommend that you look them up. So anyways, getting into the site, within the watershed, looking for a site, like I said, was heavily influenced by the location of agriculture, but also where there is a lack of sort of an established beverage industry. And you can see these on these two maps here. And ultimately, a site was chosen on the eastern shore, along the Route 50 corridor on the Nanticoke River in a town called Vienna. And so Vienna is located on the Nanticoke River, directly between Cambridge and Salisbury, and is a model Chesapeake Bay community. And this thesis seeks to reinforce its comprehensive plan in that it is a water-focused community focused on sustainable growth and development. And so the next couple slides are an illustration of several overlaid maps to demonstrate the growth of the town and how the town might continue to grow into the future. And so the town's historic identity is rooted in the Bay region as one of the many places that Captain John Smith visited on his voyage around the bay in 1608. And then the town was formally founded just under 100 years later as two blocks parallel to the river on the outside of the Oxbow. By the 1900s, the Baltimore and Eastern Shore Railroad came right through the town, bringing people, goods, and establishing the town as a place along the route to Ocean City. And then by the 1920s, the Eastern Shore Gas and Electric Company chose Vienna as a site for its new coal-fired electric generating plant, which is still active today and an industrial driver for the town. Soon after, the first concrete two-lane vehicular bridge was built across the river, highlighted in red. And then several decades later, the Chesapeake Bay Bridge is constructed in the 1950s, bringing further development and population across the river, and really you can see some expansion of the town. However, by the 1990s, it was common practice that many small bay towns were bypassed by Route 50. New highways were constructed, and a new bridge was constructed just north of the town, diverting traffic around Vienna rather than through it. And this essentially actually preserved sort of the small town nature of the town. And so by the 21st century, it's largely unchanged. However, in 2009, there was really significant effort to invest in and grow the town. Over 365 acres of land were annexed to the town with the intention of development, as well as investments in the public waterfront. And so the next couple diagrams are looking at how the town can continue to grow. And it all begins with the original municipal boundary, which will really remain the epicenter for outward growth. Tier 2 is the developable land within the annexed property, and includes a proposed residential development of cottages and single-family homes, which can illustrate the town's beginnings of growth and development. And then the town can continue to expand along the old Route 50 corridor into that wedge. And looking far ahead into the future, where the power plant might become obsolete or replaced by renewable energy resources, the town has an opportunity to actually mirror across the old Route 50 corridor and grow that way. And so this was important for choosing a site for where Meadworks ends up. And Meadworks has been sited at the threshold between the town fabric and the power plant just north of the site. But it's also at the threshold and gateway where the old Route 50 once bridged across the river. And so it has quite significance at this vertex. It also provides the opportunity to establish a node on the north end of the town's public waterfront park system. And then it has a tangential relationship to the industry, as well as the existing water treatment facility in the town, which is undersized. And then the elementary school, which is right up the street, has the opportunity to use this place as a learning tool for students to learn all about the bay, the ecosystems, bees, honey, etc. And with Nanticoke Landing, the planned development to the south and Mead Works to the north, the public waterfront is extended and essentially bookends both sides of the town and establishes a strong waterfront presence. And so as you can see, the Mead Works site is really centrally located among these resources and where the town might continue to grow. So looking at the proposal, I began with just the program on site in a highly visible site at the termination of that old Route 50 access at the waterfront. However, what this did was it blocked that visual connection to the waterfront, which is very important. And so the program was then split into two separate buildings to create a campus. Furthermore, then based on the program, the proportions and sizes were adjusted, and the Mead Works building, which is now separate from the Waterworks building, was rotated to address the landscape, whereas the Waterworks building addresses terracing wetlands down to the waterfront. And then the Waterworks building was depressed into the landscape, and the Mead Works building was risen above. And both buildings were outfitted with a shed roof sloping inwards towards the wetlands to divert rainwater, but it's also sort of referential to the barns and sheds that are all across the eastern shore. And so, looking at the site plan, which is also up on the second board here, the site is really organized into a campus. It has 4 buildings, the Waterworks to the north and the Mead Works to the south, as well as 2 support structures. And this organization really helps frame an outdoor room on the site. And this outdoor room is then subdivided into 2 zones: the orchard or the wetlands by the Waterworks building, as well as the pollinator gardens and the lawn by the Mead Works building. And you can see that the public spaces of these buildings really relate to each of these landscape elements. And so the organization of the site is really built off of this axis of the void of where old Route 50 once came through the site and bridged across the river. And the buildings are also further juxtaposed in the way that they're sited in the site. The Waterworks building is a heavier wall-based structure that's sunken into the land, whereas the Mead Works building is more of a delicate pavilion in the landscape that's risen on piles. And so many landscape elements and structural elements were also used in the landscape to unify the whole site and create places of movement and stasis. Although the site is really open for sort of exploration as almost a park when the buildings may not be open, the architecture suggests a certain rhythm and path that leads users through the site. And beginning the approach to the site from down the old Route 50 corridor, trees and the cisterns guide visitors along the boardwalk into the entrance for the Waterworks building or directly out to the pier on the waterfront. And inside the Waterworks building, visitors can take a tour on a catwalk level above all of the water treatment processes below, learning about those processes and the importance that they have on the bay. And so I'd like to pass around this model also to illustrate that relationship. At the end of this tour is a room at the end of the building that frames views out to the waterfront and the landscape beyond, which is largely undeveloped. You can't really see any buildings for miles beyond. And so it's really a place of contemplation and appreciation for the natural environment and all of the processes that were previously learned about in that journey to this place. And from there, visitors can venture out onto the pier or explore the landscape and even walk the line between the waterscape on the left of the wetlands and the landscape of the meadows on the right. There's also an orchard in which several hives are organized with bees to produce honey. And this honey is then extracted and used in the Mead Works building to produce local mead. But this also gives the opportunity to the public and school children to come here, learn about beekeeping, and learn about flowers and the environment and what all entails in the process. And finally, visitors end up in the hive or the tap room at the Mead Works building, which I have another model of. And this space, and this building essentially, is built off of a grid that establishes it as a cellular structure that this tap room inserts itself into as a figural space and double height atrium. This building, much like the Waterworks building, is also very open, where people can observe all of the processes occurring in the making of the mead beyond the bar. But it's also open on both sides, the landscape and the waterfront, allowing for people to be in the space, but also connected to the landscape outside and the river. And so in summary, this thesis was really an exploration of an experimental new approach to public water infrastructure, specifically for the Bay region. But it proposes a scalable model that can be adapted and implemented across the region in other towns to enact greater change for the outlook of the Chesapeake Bay and its water quality. And so with that, I'd like to open it up for questions. Thank you.
In this area, I assume there's going to be potential sea level rise?
Correct.
How did you think about that with your project?
Here you go. So the good thing about the town of Vienna is that they sited it on the outside of an oxbow, which makes the town automatically elevated and protected by a sandbar. And luckily, all of the land directly across the river is really, really low-lying marshland that is tidal and floods. And so with a typical high tide of 2 feet, the marshland might seem to be disappearing, but Vienna has no effect. And so this is FEMA's sea level rise for year 2050, which is 2.1 feet. And it's also marked on the sections here. And so the darkest blue is the typical low tide, and then the next shade is typical high tide, the 2050 sea level rise, and the 2100 sea level rise. And so 2100 sea level rise is 5.7 feet. But the architecture, you can see in some of the sections I explored how high off of the water that the architecture really had to be. And so the Waterworks building, although it's depressed into the landscape, its lower level is still several feet above seawater. And then the Mead Works building, as I said, it's raised above the landscape over 8 feet. So.
And the Route 50 right-of-way, you just pointed out where that is on the figure ground. Just go back to that figure ground, if you don't mind. Just show us where it came through.
The Route 50?
Yeah, where it came through.
It came right down here.
It's like
Yeah.
it's kind of your dock. It's like,
So your building is,
Which one was Mead and which building is which?
So the Mead building is the one on the water, oriented to the landscape in the water, and the Waterworks building faces the wetlands. But this heavier red dash is the path of the old Route 50. And then in the 90s, it was diverted that way.
Yeah.
But is the bridge still there?
It is not, unfortunately. There's really no remnants of it, too.
Yeah.
I visited the site, and I expected that maybe there was some structure left out in the water, but it's really
Could you
sort of
clarify
big.
what you mean by the waterworks building in terms of its functions, and if there's, I don't know, how this system works to clean the water and deal with the gray water?
Sure, yeah. So, yeah, the waterworks building is an advanced water purification facility. It's not treating sewage water, it's treating secondary effluent, so basically water that has already been treated at a wastewater facility or stormwater. So it's already been cleaned. It's just using advanced practices like reverse osmosis to further purify the water before it's being released out into the wetlands and the environment.
And where's that water coming from? And how's it getting into the building?
The water comes from either the Vienna wastewater treatment plant, or the facility has also been sized in a way that it can accommodate almost the entire Dorchester County's wastewater.
Is it going to be piped?
Correct, yeah.
Pump there.
Yeah, pumps there, correct.
Can you walk through what happens in some of those spaces? Like, are there?
So the water treatment facility, all of the processes happen on the lower level. And basically, there's a loading with chemical storage and sort of administrative uses. And then it's a parallel train process, basically, where there's two separate processes going on that are the same side by side, so that, for example, if one system has some sort of an issue or an error, the other system can continue to work. And so both of these systems run down either side of the building, and then the finished product is released into the wetlands and out into the landscape. In the Mead Works building, the production happens in this bar here, and the tap room is a 30 by 30 cube here, related to the porch and the waterfront, as well as pollinator gardens and the alley of pipes.
So can the public go in the top building?
Yeah, yeah. So this level is at +2 from the water, and this level is at +12. And so when you walk into the site, you're actually at +10, and so there's a ramp and stairs to get you to the lobby to allow for you to be at a catwalk level above all of these processes. And so in the model, there's a series of places where tours can take off of the catwalk and sort of stop and learn about each individual process along the way. Exactly, yeah. And so you can walk down the catwalk, and at each of these individual spaces, you can kind of take a rest and learn about each step of the process.
So I'm just going to start. I just want to say that I think this is a really well crafted. You had the word craft up on there, and the crafting of Mead and everything. It's a really beautifully crafted project from I think the initial premise. I want you to go back. Don't do it now, but I want to steal the diagrams that you used, where you talk about taking the program, taking the kind of utility program, and then coupling it with this public program, and that's you have to do that. I almost feel I wish we had a rule that said you always had to do that, because you put those two things together, and the resultant program of the utility thing has to be something different. It can't just be status quo. It has to relate to that. And then even down to, and I don't necessarily want to jump into this too much, but even sometimes we see computer renderings or renderings, things that kind of make something look really good that isn't really good. But I think the quality of the renderings, it's actually even better on the screen, because the yellow around it muddies everything. But when you put these renderings, I've never seen a rendering quite like this, with the white bees and the white people and the white, there's just, it's remarkable to me, the quality of that, kind of atmosphere that you're creating and telling the story with. And there's a lot of thinking and architecture and kind of and thoughtfulness in the sections and the materials that all kind of comes through. So I'll stop at that. The one criticism I have is just kind of like some of the like final resolution of the buildings. And one of the things I really, I really want to see, like, I feel like this moment where you have this kind of extending in the water is great. I really wish there was something more kind of like the punchline at the end. Like, I want to take that double height space and push. I don't like that kind of this section being cut there so that this double height space is hidden. Like, I want it to push out and like hover over the water and have a deck, you know, like, so that, like you see in the section here, it's like where that kind of gets cut off from the water by this extra section. Like, I want to push that out. I want that to like express itself on the surface, like the hive piece,
Right.
so you see it from the water.
Thanks.
Alex, I wanted to comment too on the depiction of the project. You know, more often than not, either we get something that's undercooked in terms of rendering, where it's just kind of black and white, and you could have probably done it better in ink on mylar the way we used to do it, right? Or you get something that's photorealist right out of the box, and it has like no judgment whatsoever in it, and that's 99% of the time that's what you get, and to me that's crap. And what's interesting about this, it reminds me, this is in the category of theses like Ken Filler's, where what I see, you have a self-awareness of the image, and I think that's rare. And it's a shame it's rare, because in architecture you would think that architects would all go around with awareness that the image really counts. And in this case, it's almost to me like a painterly quality, so that when there's certain painters that are photorealist kind of painters like Ang and stuff like that produce a surface, even Poussin produced a surface that almost doesn't look like a brush has ever touched the canvas. It almost looks like it's a reality in and of itself. But you're calling our attention right back again to the illusion, by the framing technique, by the insertion of the silhouette people and so forth like that, and then by a very careful judgment in terms of the composition and the color. And I think that more people that are sitting back there that are planning to do theses ought to be paying attention to what you've done here, and that this is really a very sophisticated way of moving the ball down the field in terms of depicting architecture.
Thank you.
We talk a lot about contextualism and context and how that ties to the forms we create and the materials we choose and the implementation of our specific objectives, and I think you've really captured that. Turning the old Route 50 into a pier that extends into the water takes you to the place beyond, I would almost say. The interweaving of the different functions of the pollinator gardens and the engineered wetlands, and making that both an experience but something that harkens back to your vision and your goals of the hydrology and the ecology and everything coming together is wonderful. It's funny you said painter, I was thinking of Turner in some context, and kind of that old American romanticism in painting, but at the same time you don't feel lost, you don't feel it's a fantasy, you feel it can be real. I love that you brought the little study models out. I don't know if other students have done that, but it tells me, and it shows it again in the drawings, that you really explored the inside and the outside of the space and how you would inhabit it and how you would go through it. I do kind of agree with your comment though. It would have been almost like a jewel if you popped out that into the water and put it on piles as well. I'm sure you can think of a million other little tweaks you could make. I actually love also that it's not just the pier, that you brought the structure of the facility over the old Route 50 and created like a corridor almost. And now it's a pedestrian corridor that you're transitioning around and in and out of that building, but the main artery still resonates, so you're bringing the past into it. Really well done.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
I echo all the comments that we've heard. I completely agree with the presentation. It's just really stunning and beautiful. I have just a couple other comments. I'm wondering about the wall.
Sure.
the big wall.
Yeah.
And I think that there's some really, I mean, I keep looking at it thinking that it's this sort of aquifer piece, it's like aqueduct piece that's kind of running through the site, and that you're trying to reference that in some way, sort of Roman. And so I wonder a little bit about that, and whether it kind of needs to be so tall at that point, or
Right.
whether it appears somewhere else in the town, and just how you are engaging with it in terms of the section right there. So that's one thing that I'd love to hear a little bit more about, and how that kind of came about. And then the other thing I would say is, I think I agree with Alex's comments, because partly you are just leaving us wanting a little bit more. And one thing that I feel like this site might, and I don't know, maybe you looked at this, but I don't know if you looked at having a restaurant or a cafe or a lot of these sort of farm-to-table destinations, because this will be a destination. So what will happen is people will come here, they'll have a bunch of wonderful drinks, and then they'll say, well, where do we go to dinner? And, you know, is there really another nice place to go to dinner in Vienna? I'm not sure. So I would definitely think about, you know, expanding your program. There's a lot of infrastructure to put in here, and maybe you very purposely kept it very defined, which has allowed you to create a really beautiful and well-detailed space. But that's just something that, the other thing I would say is, you've given us a million amazing renderings, but I wonder if you looked at this at night. Because seeing that little, you know, what I think of as like this little hive that almost has these cross bracing on top of it, which are going to give you this very sort of honeycomb feel, I could imagine being really, really powerful at night. So I'm sure Professor Newton probably told you to do that, you just didn't get to it.
Maybe. I certainly thought about it. I mean, I have the same ideas, that it would be a glowing sort of beacon in that landscape.
It would really be.
So.
And actually, the first time I saw the addition to the Kennedy Center was
Yeah.
in a kayak on the river in the summer at night.
Yeah.
And it was
Cool.
just going to show the position maybe from being a boat, or
Yeah.
the time of year when there were fireflies there.
Yeah,
or
yeah.
something else.
That would be good.
Portfolio.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I got to start writing a list of all these other things.
But yeah, I'd love to hear any more comments about the wall, and sort of how you're, if you looked at separating away from it, is it made of anything special?
So I'm going to start with the easy question of the restaurant and that sort of program. And that was originally in my program last semester when I was doing all the research, as you know, food and beverage obviously goes together. It's a market sector. But what happened was I did some more research, and the liquor licensing of a brewery with food is very complicated. And so I was also trying to downsize the...
Even on the Eastern Shore?
I don't know about the Eastern Shore specifically, but I also was out of scale. I had too much program. It was too big of a scale for the size of the town. And so I tried to reduce the scale back to something that can at least not be too stark against the fabric existing in the town. And so that was sort of the reasoning behind that. But to the wall and all of the walls in the landscape that I had mentioned are gabion walls. And so they're porous, they're just essentially rocks in a crate, for those of you who don't know. And that allows the water to pass through it, organisms to create habitats in them. But it was a means of creating a datum line through the waterworks building and creating a relationship between the processes and still a tactile relationship with the environment. And it guides people down that path, but also creates a rhythm of enclosure when you're looking at processes, or openings to look at processes on the other side. And it repeats all over the landscape, including in front of the Mead Works building, as well as terracing of the wetlands.
You know, in the drawings, the models, the language of the Mead building and the water building look different. In the drawings, they look very similar. You know, and was there ever any thought given to making them more distinct? Like, for example, what's the utility in having a sloped roof for the Mead building as well as for the other building?
That was something that I had a lot of exploration doing. At first, they were completely different. The Waterworks building was a more sort of sculptural piece, sort of standing in the landscape, whereas the Meadworks building was more smaller pavilions. And then it became that it needed to have a similar language to read as a cohesive campus and not two separate projects, essentially. And so that's where looking at barns across the Eastern Shore and sheds came to the realization that doing a more simple shed roof form and having it divert water from the roofs into the wetlands provided a more simple solution.
Well, my only comment is along the lines of what Alec was saying. The Waterworks building and its perpendicular relationship to the water's edge makes a lot of sense to me. I move along the edge of it. It helps frame one edge of the garden and I get views out there. The Mead building, particularly when I look at this view and I look at the solid wall and I look at where the space is that Alec was pointing out before and how I get to it, it doesn't reinforce the site, I think, as much as it could, And I wonder, makes me wonder, well, would I have actually moved it more inboard and maybe made it a building that was caught between some of those engineered wetland walls and made more part of the kind of fabric? And then maybe the dining pavilion could have been more of an object out there. I think it's caught between becoming something that it wants to be that isn't quite there yet. It's a lovely project and the level of thought and that rendering there is really quite extraordinary. It's just that building, when I think about the expanse of the rivers and the landscape of the Eastern Shore and how the plane of the water and the plane of the landscape on the other side is so limitless and stuff. And I think about going there and I think about that building, kind of limiting that and not necessarily reframing a very small part of that. It begs a question for me about what role that building is playing, because the Waterworks building is very, very clear to me. The Mead building, I'm still wondering, is it framing the landscape? Is it trying to be an object? What is its real role in all of this? And it's a little bit less clear to me about that building than about the other one.
One of my earlier explorations was this one, where they were essentially two parallel bar buildings, maybe one skewed a little bit, but from the land out to the water. But the reason I diverted away from that design was that it sort of cut through the site and cut it into almost thirds. If a building were placed here, that this area became less of a usable landscape. And by rotating the building and placing it on the waterfront, it captured the site rather than giving the site away to the water necessarily.
That elevation is so open back towards the gardens. So that elevation was also on the water.
Yeah,
The water, that's right. Transparency through the
Make
building.
it a big porch,
So-
screen it.
It's a little deceiving because these four bays here are the porch on the waterfront, and these are sliding shed doors that can close off that porch if it needs to be
But I
enclosed
think
during
what colleagues
storms
talk
and
about is
things.
possibly a typology of a loggia around the building that could actually engage all the sides.
We're going to roof all the way down to a point so that it's really kind of meeting the horizon lines.
And also not disrupting the visual, so you can actually see through the building. It doesn't have to be that the building is not there, but you could have transparency through the building.
Well, like the ribbon window at the Villa Savoie, where you look over and it gives you the panorama of the landscape, the building can do it similarly.
So I'm not going to repeat the things that have been said that are really good. I think you are actually in the right place because, compared to the complexity and the scale of the previous one, you were actually good at it. So I don't know if you thought that, but if you didn't, then you had just somebody to thank, or probably Carl Dupuy or somebody. And so I saw presentation and everything. I have two things that I think would be relevant to think about. One talks about the function of the building, not only as a place where you clearly have differentiated the functional part of it, cleaning water and then producing this spirit, but also educating people about it. And you have centered very much in how these two things are important, but I am missing the most important thing, which is the whole thing about how water, how the Chesapeake actually ends up being in the Chesapeake River, a very important part of the whole thing, which is basically, I mean, I could resume it by basically walking outside your buildings. That part, to me, is not very clear. It's very clear how I go through your buildings and how I pass from one to another. But I'm not sure how I could learn about the importance of bees and the whole process, about the importance of actually the marshes purifying water, like naturally, not through chemical processes. And then within that, and by the way, I think that in the composition, I'm missing something that tells me, you know, I start here. I enter very easily into the site, but I don't have something that clearly marks where am I entering. And I'm not saying a door or a gate or anything like that. Something that tells me, you know, this is where something marks the point where I'm actually feeling inside of it. I think you mark very well at the end, but not the beginning. But then there's the issue of the scale of this. You know, I'm seeing this, and it's a small thing. It's relatively a small thing, and it makes me think, you know, is this what it takes to actually do what you're talking about? The bigger thing, you know, is like a replication of smaller things. I don't have that very clear. Even the scale of your orchard, I don't know if this is enough to actually produce the honey that is needed to.
Right.
I have no clarity of that. It makes me think it's not. But I think I'm missing that. When I see the building inserted in the bigger context, I think it was in one of the last slides that you have here. Yeah, but we're basically looking back towards the town, towards Vienna. Towards the end, I think it was. When I see that, it makes me think that, that's good. It makes me think that this is actually part of a much bigger thing. But then I'm missing the trees in the town that will talk about that kind of symbiosis between this and the town as being a town that actually is part of a bigger thing. And then I have an idea that was suggested, I think, by Lena, I think, when you just say, you know, is this wall starting here or start somewhere in the town? I think it would be a good idea that some of the elements that you have taken as dorsal components of this could actually belong to a bigger thing, such as the fact that you were at the end of route, what is it?
50.
50. But I don't know that unless I have a map in my hand.
Right.
What if I could know that, and then perhaps my gate is not here, it's actually outside town, you know, where I see that there's a relationship, connection between the elements that you have chosen to compose your project and the entire town, which actually will make very easy then place your restaurant anywhere in town that you want it.
Yeah.
See what I'm saying? Like extending this thing instead of having it as something very localized, very functional, letting it be and connect with the rest of the town.
Well, I think it's sort of a catalytic development that once that is established, the town can then continue to grow.
I totally agree with you. I think that as soon as you set these up, people are going to start growing flowers in their gardens and backers and things like that.
Right.
But I think that's something that makes that connection clear as an architect, as somebody who's structured this idea would be nice.
Okay.
Somebody
You call it Eva.
Yes, that's right.
There
That's
might
right. That's right.
There might be more than honestly.
I mean, it's a great opportunity. Why wouldn't you? And then forget about it. I mean, this is a thesis. Forget about how artists to find a license to have. We'll deal with that later.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that they used to sure would accept alcohol.
Yeah.
So you know, after sitting through the other 5 presentations, this is painterly, calm, and I'm ready to drink. So
Good.
I see that. Thank you. I think that there are parts of your presentation that are hyper strong that have already been articulated. Again, we want to call everyone's attention to your 5 diagrams, which are a foundation of great modern architecture. architecture. So, your process is terrific. I think your program is light for a thesis. So, that the program's a little light, and the techniques of the workings of the water treatment building, and a little more exploration and larger scale explanation of parts of that diagrammatically in reality for both buildings would be really helpful. And they're so tiny that I struggle with it just a little bit.
Okay.
And it's not kind of apparent what it is that you're proposing to do.
Right.
I worked on a PA award-winning water treatment plant many years ago.
Cool.
And so I have a great affinity for this.
Cool.
But at the end of the day, this one's a little bit light in terms of explaining it and graphically presenting it, other than these beautiful pictures.
Great.
So I think it's a great project, simply done, well presented, but it is a little bit light. So.
I also think if you connect it with the entire town, you sort that out.
Right.
Because it's an issue of the scale of what you're doing.
Okay.
So I want to thank Kyle for wrapping up the day and the series of thesis projects we've seen actually over the last 3 days. I just jotted down a few of the words that were used, this idea of calm and painterly, well-crafted. They describe not only the project, but Kyle's process and the attention that he brings to the culmination of his degree here. I think the critique you received was well put, and some of the questions about the fine-grained approach to how the water treatment works, how open the meadery building is to the waterfront, I think are all appropriate and suggest that there's enough kind of deliberate work here that the project can take that kind of critique as you look both backward and forward.
Right.
I didn't really get to know you or some of your cohort until you came into the graduate program, and on the education abroad opportunities that the school offers, whether you're in Central Europe or Northern Europe or Canada. It's great to see those experiences coming back and informing theses. Thank you for taking us on this journey, and we are looking forward to what you do next. Congratulations.